There is something strange about the samurai. More than a century after the last of them disappeared, they still feel almost unreal. The armor, the masks, the swords forged through fire, warriors meditating before battle, writing death poems, carrying the names of their ancestors into combat. And beneath all of it, the idea that death itself did not frighten them. But here is where the story becomes more interesting, because the samurai we remember today is partly history and partly something Japan created afterward. They were not born following one timeless code called Bushido. They were not all wandering masters of the katana. And they were certainly not always loyal. Some changed sides. Some betrayed their lords. Some burned temples, collected severed heads, and destroyed entire families in wars for power. Yet reducing them to brutal soldiers would be just as misleading. For centuries, these warriors developed a culture unlike almost anything else. A man could practice archery in the morning, study poetry at night, prepare incense, meditate on mortality, and kill another man the following day. Religion surrounded their world. Shinto traditions connected people to sacred places, ancestors, and forces within nature. Buddhism offered another way to understand suffering, impermanence, and death. Later generations of warriors would become particularly associated with Zen, not because Zen magically transformed them into fearless killing machines. That image owes a great deal to later romanticization. But because the idea of controlling the mind while accepting impermanence fit naturally into a world where death could arrive without warning. And then there was the sword. To later generations, it became almost the soul of the samurai. But the earliest samurai were not primarily swordsmen. Their defining weapon was something else entirely. They were mounted archers. And even the word samurai did not originally describe the legendary warrior we imagine today. It came from a world in which powerful families were slowly losing control of the violence around them. Far from Japan's imperial court, armed clans were becoming richer, more independent, more dangerous. And eventually, the men who had once existed to serve the aristocracy would do something extraordinary. They would take control of Japan itself. The age of the samurai was about to begin. The samurai did not appear because Japan decided it needed a warrior class. They emerged because the government was losing control. For centuries, political authority centered on the imperial court in Kyoto. The emperor remained sacred and important, but real power increasingly surrounded aristocratic families who competed for influence at court. Far from Kyoto, however, Japan looked very different. Provincial estates needed protection. Land disputes became violent. Local officials struggled to enforce authority. Powerful families began maintaining armed followers who could defend territory, collect revenues, and settle conflicts by force. These warriors were the ancestors of the samurai, and their earliest image would surprise anyone expecting a swordsman standing beneath cherry blossoms. The elite warrior of this period was often a mounted archer. His bow could matter more than his sword. His identity came from family, land, reputation, and service. Combat itself could be intensely personal. Later war tales describe warriors announcing their lineage before fighting because defeating an important opponent brought prestige. But we have to be careful. Much of what we imagine about early samurai warfare comes through chronicles written as literature as well as history. The legend was already beginning to form. By the 12th century, two warrior families had become especially powerful, the Taira and the Minamoto. Their rivalry would transform Japan. The Taira initially gained the advantage. Under Taira no Kiyomori, the clan became deeply involved in imperial politics, placing relatives in powerful positions and extending its influence through marriage. But dominance created enemies. In 1180, conflict erupted into what became known as the Genpei War. For 5 years, Japan was torn by fighting between networks aligned with the Taira and Minamoto. This was not simply two armies meeting once on a battlefield. It was a struggle involving shifting alliances, regional power, and family survival. And from it emerged some of the most famous figures in Japanese history. One was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, brilliant, bold, and eventually doomed. Yoshitsune became celebrated for victories against the Taira, including the final confrontation at Dan no Ura in 1185. There, the conflict moved onto the water. Taira and Minamoto fleets fought in the narrow straits. When defeat became unavoidable, members of the Taira court threw themselves into the sea. Among the dead was the child emperor Antoku. According to the famous war chronicle, The Tale of the Heike, his grandmother took him into her arms before disappearing beneath the waves. Whether every dramatic detail happened exactly as later literature described is impossible to know. But the image endured because it captured something central to samurai culture. Power disappears. Families disappear. Glory disappears. Nothing lasts. That idea of impermanence, deeply resonant with Buddhist thought, runs through the Tale of the Heike from its opening lines. The Taira were finished, but Yoshitsune did not become ruler. His own brother, Minamoto no Yoritomo, viewed his growing fame and independence as a threat. Yoshitsune became a fugitive. Eventually surrounded, he died in 1189. One of Japan's greatest warrior heroes had survived his enemies, only to be destroyed by his own family. And Yoritomo? He won something far greater than a battle. In 1192, he received the title shogun. From his military government at Kamakura, a new political order took shape. The emperor remained in Kyoto. The imperial institution survived. But another center of power now existed, a warrior government. Japan had entered an age in which military families could rule without abolishing the emperor at all. That arrangement would evolve, fracture, and be rebuilt for centuries. And it created one of the strangest political systems in history, an emperor who remained sacred, and warriors who increasingly held the power. But the samurai's next great test would not come from another Japanese clan. It would come from across the sea. An empire that had already crushed kingdoms from China to Eastern Europe was expanding toward Japan. The Mongols were coming. In 1274, the samurai encountered an enemy unlike anything they had faced before. The Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire in history. Now Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Yuan dynasty, demanded that Japan submit. The Japanese refused, so the Mongols came. Their first invasion force crossed from Korea and landed on Tsushima. The island's defenders were overwhelmed. From there, the invaders moved toward Kyushu, and Japanese warriors discovered that their traditions of warfare did not necessarily match the enemy in front of them. Mongol-led forces operated in coordinated formations and used weapons and battlefield methods unfamiliar to many Japanese defenders. Contemporary Japanese sources also depict explosive projectiles, an unsettling technology in 13th century warfare. The samurai fought back, but this was no heroic duel between individual champions. This was organized invasion. The fighting around Hakata Bay became intense. Then the invading fleet withdrew. A storm may have contributed to its losses, although later tradition would magnify the role of divine intervention. Japan had survived, but Kublai Khan was not finished. 7 years later, in 1281, an even larger invasion was launched. This time, the Japanese had prepared. Defensive walls had been constructed along parts of Hakata Bay. Samurai attacked enemy positions and ships. For weeks, the invasion stalled. And then nature intervened again. A powerful typhoon struck the Mongol fleets. Ships were smashed. Men drowned. The invasion collapsed. Over time, these storms acquired a name loaded with meaning: kamikaze, the divine wind. And here the mystical image of the samurai becomes especially interesting. To later generations, Japan had not merely defeated the world's most terrifying empire. Japan had been protected. The gods themselves seem to have defended the islands, but history is rarely that clean. The storms mattered enormously, especially in 1281. Yet Japanese defenses, Mongol logistical problems, naval vulnerabilities, and sustained resistance mattered too. The legend simplified something far more complicated. And there was another problem. Victory had been expensive. In earlier wars, victorious warriors could be rewarded with confiscated enemy land. But the Mongols had brought no Japanese territory that could easily be distributed after their defeat. Samurai had fought, spent resources, risked their lives, and many expected rewards the Kamakura government struggled to provide. The system had survived the invasion, but the victory helped expose weaknesses inside it. Over the following decades, dissatisfaction grew. The Kamakura shogunate weakened. By 1333, it collapsed. But instead of restoring stable imperial rule, Japan entered another period of political fragmentation. Competing imperial courts emerged. Warrior families fought for influence. A new shogunate arose under the Ashikaga, and once again, the emperor remained while military rulers competed over who actually controlled the country. If you've stayed with me this far, subscribe to the channel and come back with us every day. Because the deeper you go into samurai history, the less it resembles the clean story most of us were given. And what happened next is where that becomes impossible to ignore. For all the later talk about loyalty, discipline, and absolute obedience, samurai politics could be ruthless. Alliances shifted, lords betrayed one another, families divided. Warriors chose survival over loyalty when circumstances demanded it. The romantic code we now call Bushido was not one fixed rulebook governing every samurai across 700 years. Ideas of honor, duty, and warrior behavior certainly existed, but they changed with time, place, and political reality. And soon that reality would become extraordinarily violent. In 1467, a succession dispute and conflicts among powerful families helped ignite the Onin War. Kyoto became a battlefield. Fighting devastated large sections of the capital. Authority fractured. And when the war ended, nobody had truly restored control. Instead, Japan entered the age that would create the samurai we recognize most easily today. An age of castles, armies, betrayal, ambition, and almost continuous warfare. The Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. And in that world, the samurai would reach the height of their military power, while becoming something very different from the warriors who had first taken control of Japan. By the 16th century, Japan had become a country where power could change hands with a single betrayal. The shogun still existed. The emperor still existed. But across much of Japan, real authority belonged to regional warlords known as daimyo. They built castles, raised armies, made alliances, broke them, and fought relentlessly for territory. This was the Sengoku period. And if you want to understand the real samurai, this is where the romantic image begins to break apart. Loyalty mattered, honor mattered, but so did survival. A samurai might serve one lord today and another tomorrow. A daimyo could be betrayed by his own retainers. Brothers fought brothers. Sons rebelled against fathers. Entire clans could disappear after one disastrous battle. And warfare itself was changing. The samurai sword, especially the katana, would eventually become the great symbol of the warrior class. But on Sengoku battlefields, victory depended on far more than swordsmanship. Spears were everywhere. Archery remained important. Large formations mattered. And then Europeans arrived. In 1543, Portuguese traders reached Japan, carrying something that would transform Japanese warfare: firearms. The Japanese quickly began producing matchlock guns known as tanagashima. Within decades, firearms were being used in significant numbers. The image of the samurai as a warrior who rejected guns because they were somehow dishonorable is largely a later fantasy. Samurai used whatever worked, and one man understood that better than almost anyone: Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was ambitious, ruthless, and unusually willing to break established patterns. In 1560, at the Battle of Okahazama, his much smaller force defeated the army of Imagawa Yoshimoto in a stunning victory. From there, Nobunaga expanded. He entered Kyoto, manipulated and eventually displaced the Ashikaga shogunate, destroyed rivals, and used organized armies, firearms, and aggressive strategy to push Japan toward reunification. But Nobunaga was not simply fighting other samurai. Powerful Buddhist institutions could maintain armed forces and control territory. One of the darkest episodes of his career came in 1571, when his forces attacked the temple complex on Mount Hiei. Buildings were burned, monks and civilians were killed. The event became part of Nobunaga's terrifying reputation. This is another uncomfortable reality behind the samurai legend. Their world was not neatly divided between sacred monks and secular warriors. Religion, politics, and military power could overlap. Temples could become fortresses. Warriors could be deeply religious and still commit extraordinary violence. Nobunaga appeared increasingly unstoppable. Then in 1582, the logic of the Sengoku world caught up with him. One of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him. Nobunaga was trapped at Honnoji in Kyoto. With escape apparently impossible, he died there, traditionally believed to have committed seppuku. The man who had survived countless enemies was destroyed by betrayal from inside his own command. But his project did not die with him. Another extraordinary figure moved immediately, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born into comparatively humble circumstances, Hideyoshi rose through Nobunaga's ranks and became one of the most powerful men in Japan. He defeated Mitsuhide, eliminated rivals, and by 1590, he had effectively unified the country. A man without the pedigree of Japan's ancient warrior families had climbed to the top of the samurai political world. But unification created a new question. What happens to a warrior society when there are fewer wars left to fight? Hideyoshi attempted to stabilize the social order, including measures that separated warriors from peasants and restricted possession of weapons. Then he directed samurai violence outward. In 1592, Japanese armies invaded Korea. Hideyoshi dreamed of conquest beyond Japan. The war became brutal. Japanese forces advanced rapidly at first, but Korean resistance, Ming Chinese intervention, and naval victories associated with Admiral Yi Sun-sin helped frustrate Hideyoshi's ambitions. A second invasion followed. It failed too. Hideyoshi died in 1598. Japanese forces withdrew. And once again, the question of who would control Japan remained unresolved. One final confrontation was coming. In 1600, armies gathered near a small village called Sekigahara. The battle would decide who controlled the country, and the victor would build a system so effective that Japan would experience more than 2 centuries without another nationwide civil war. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. On October 21, 1600, the future of Japan was decided in a valley filled with fog. At Sekigahara, forces loyal to Tokugawa Ieyasu confronted a coalition led politically by Ishida Mitsunari. Tens of thousands of warriors faced one another, but the battle would not be decided by courage alone. It would be decided by something that appears again and again in samurai history: betrayal. Several commanders hesitated or changed sides. Most famously, Kublai Khan Hideaki eventually attacked forces aligned against Tokugawa. The balance collapsed. By the end of the day, Ieyasu had effectively won control of Japan. 3 years later, he became shogun. The Tokugawa era had begun. And here is the paradox. The samurai had spent centuries becoming the most powerful warrior class in Japan. Now their greatest political achievement would slowly make their original purpose unnecessary. The Tokugawa created a remarkably effective system for controlling the daimyo. Regional lords retained domains, but the shogunate watched them carefully. One of its most powerful mechanisms was sankin kotai, alternate attendance. Daimyo were required to spend substantial periods in Edo, the Tokugawa capital, while their families were generally kept there. Maintaining multiple residences and traveling with large processions was enormously expensive. That was partly the point. A lord spending fortunes displaying his status had fewer resources available for rebellion. Roads improved, castle towns grew, commerce expanded. Edo became one of the world's largest cities, and Japan entered more than 2 centuries without the kind of nationwide warfare that had defined the Sengoku age. So what happened to the samurai? They changed. Many became administrators, officials, teachers, scholars, managers of domains. They still carried swords and possessed privileged social status, but generations could pass without experiencing the kind of battlefield warfare their ancestors had known. And during this long peace, something fascinating happened to the idea of the samurai. It became more philosophical. Writers increasingly tried to define what a warrior should be when there were fewer wars left to fight. Loyalty, self-control, duty, readiness for death. These ideas were real, but the neat universal system often presented today as an ancient and unchanging Bushido code was much more complicated. Different domains had different traditions. Different thinkers emphasized different virtues. And some texts now treated as timeless samurai manuals emerged precisely because the samurai were living in an age of peace. Consider Hagakure, compiled in the early 18th century from conversations with Yamamoto Tsunetomo. Its famous association between the warrior's path and death is powerful, but it was written long after the great Sengoku battlefields had gone quiet. In a strange way, samurai became more intensely idealized as actual samurai warfare became less common. The sword followed a similar transformation. It remained a weapon, but it also became a symbol of rank, identity, and authority. Swordsmanship developed into disciplined schools. Tea ceremony, calligraphy, poetry, and scholarship could exist alongside martial training. The warrior was expected, at least ideally, to cultivate more than the ability to kill. And death itself acquired ritual meaning. Seppuku, ritual suicide by cutting the abdomen, became associated with samurai honor, punishment, protest, and responsibility. But even here, reality was more varied than popular culture suggests. It was not something every samurai casually performed whenever dishonored. The ritual changed across periods and circumstances, and could be formally ordered by authorities. The mythology makes the samurai seem almost supernatural in their willingness to die. The historical reality is more human. They feared, calculated, negotiated, survived, and sometimes chose death because the social world around them made survival more unbearable than dying. But Tokugawa peace contained another contradiction. Samurai status remained high, while many samurai became financially strained. Merchants, officially ranked below warriors in the social hierarchy, could accumulate enormous wealth. A samurai might possess prestige and swords, and owe money to a merchant he was socially supposed to outrank. The old order still looked solid. Underneath, Japan was changing, and beyond Japan's shores, another world was approaching. Ships powered by industrial technology, foreign governments demanding access, weapons unlike anything the Tokugawa system had been built to confront. After centuries of surviving war, the samurai were about to face something much more dangerous: modernity. For more than 200 years, the Tokugawa system had done something extraordinary. It had kept Japan largely at peace. Then, in 1853, 4 foreign warships appeared in Edo Bay. Their hulls were dark, their engines produced smoke, and they carried a message Japan could not easily ignore. The ships belonged to the United States. Their commander was Commodore Matthew Perry. He wanted Japan to open ports to American ships and establish formal relations. And behind the diplomacy was an uncomfortable reality: industrial military power. Japan had restricted most European contact for generations, though it was never completely isolated from the outside world. Trade and information continued through controlled channels, especially with the Dutch and Chinese at Nagasaki. Japanese leaders knew Western powers existed. They knew what had happened to China during the Opium Wars. That made Perry's arrival even more disturbing. If Japan simply refused, would it be next? In 1854, the shogunate signed the Convention of Kanagawa. Other agreements followed. Foreign access expanded, and the political shock was enormous. For centuries, the samurai had justified their privileged position partly because they were the warrior class responsible for defending the realm. Now foreign ships had appeared with modern artillery, and the samurai government had been forced to negotiate. Opposition grew. A slogan spread among those resisting foreign influence and criticizing the shogunate: "Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians." But history produced an irony. Some of the domains most hostile to foreign powers, including Satsuma and Choshu, eventually understood that Japan could not defeat the industrial world by pretending it did not exist. They began acquiring modern weapons, studying Western military methods, building new forces. The men fighting in the name of Japan's ancient order were becoming agents of modernization. By the 1860s, the Tokugawa shogunate was collapsing. Political assassinations increased. domains rebelled. Foreign pressure continued. And the emperor, who for centuries had remained politically overshadowed by warrior governments, became the symbolic center of a movement to overturn the shogunate. In 1868, forces supporting imperial restoration defeated Tokugawa resistance. The event became known as the Meiji Restoration. The shogunate was finished, but the emperor did not simply return Japan to some ancient past. The new government began dismantling the very social system that had made the samurai possible. Domains were abolished. A centralized state emerged. A national conscript army was created. Hereditary samurai stipends were gradually eliminated. Then came a symbolic blow. In 1876, the government prohibited most former samurai from wearing swords in public. Think about what that meant. For generations, the paired swords had visibly separated samurai from everyone else. They were not simply weapons. They were status made physical. Now the state was telling the descendants of Japan's warrior elite, you no longer need them. Not everyone accepted that quietly. Former samurai rebelled in several regions. The largest uprising came in 1877, the Satsuma Rebellion. At its center stood Saigo Takamori. Saigo had helped overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate and build the new imperial government. Then he became one of its most famous opponents. Thousands of former samurai followed him. Popular memory would later turn Saigo into the archetype of the last samurai. But the reality was more complicated than the legend. His forces used rifles, artillery, modern military organization. This was not an army of swordsmen making one romantic final charge against machine guns. It was a civil war between men who had all been transformed by the modern world. The government possessed the deeper resources. Its conscript army could replace losses, Saigo could not. The rebellion was gradually crushed. In September 1877, the surviving rebels made their final stand near Shiroyama. Saigo was badly wounded and died. The precise circumstances of his final moments remain uncertain, despite later stories of an idealized ritual suicide. And that uncertainty matters, because the ending of the samurai was almost immediately becoming mythology. The warrior class had disappeared as a legal order, but its image was becoming more powerful than ever. Japan was modernizing at extraordinary speed. Railways, factories, conscription, Western uniforms, modern schools, a centralized government. The samurai had lost their monopoly on violence. They had lost their stipends. They had lost the right to wear their swords. Yet they were about to gain something perhaps even more enduring. They would become symbols. And the world was about to inherit a version of the samurai that the actual warriors themselves might barely have recognized. By the end of the 19th century, the samurai were gone as a legal class. But something unexpected happened. The less Japan actually needed samurai, the more powerful the idea of the samurai became. This is where history and mythology begin to overlap. Today, the word Bushido is often presented as though every samurai followed the same ancient code for centuries. Honor, absolute loyalty, self-sacrifice, fearlessness in the face of death. There is truth inside those ideas, but there was never one universal medieval handbook called Bushido that every samurai memorized and obeyed. Warriors lived under different lords, different domains, and different historical circumstances. Their values changed, and sometimes survival mattered more than loyalty. During the Sengoku period, betrayal was hardly unusual. A warrior could abandon a losing lord. A daimyo could change alliances. Retainers could overthrow masters. Tokugawa Ieyasu himself reached power partly because men changed sides at Sekigahara. The real samurai world was far messier than the legend. So where did the cleaner image come from? Part of it developed during the long peace of the Tokugawa era, when thinkers increasingly reflected on what being a warrior meant in a society where warriors rarely fought major wars. Then, after the samurai class disappeared, these older ideals were reinterpreted again. In 1900, Nitobe Inazo published Bushido, The Soul of Japan, in English. The book became enormously influential outside Japan. Nitobe presented Bushido through concepts Western readers could understand, comparing samurai ethics with European chivalry, and emphasizing virtues such as courage, honor, and loyalty. It helped introduce an idealized samurai morality to a global audience, and modern Japan found political uses for that image too. As the country industrialized and became an imperial power, selected samurai values could be transformed into national virtues: loyalty, sacrifice, obedience, willingness to die. The ancient warrior was becoming useful to a modern state. By the 20th century, the language and symbolism surrounding Bushido were sometimes connected to Japanese militarism. And during World War II, ideas of sacrifice and death for emperor and nation were presented through a warrior tradition that appeared ancient and continuous. Remember the word we encountered during the Mongol invasions? Kamikaze, the divine wind that supposedly saved Japan in the 13th century. Centuries later, that same word was applied to Japanese pilots sent on suicide attacks. History had become symbol. Symbol had become ideology. But after the war, the samurai changed again. This time through culture. Japanese cinema brought them to screens around the world. Directors such as Akira Kurosawa created samurai stories filled not merely with sword fights, but with ambiguity, duty, violence, class, and moral conflict. And their influence traveled far beyond Japan. Western filmmakers borrowed from them. The lonely swordsman became the gunslinger. The wandering Ronin became a universal character. George Lucas famously drew inspiration from Kurosawa while developing Star Wars. The silhouette changed, the archetype survived. Then came television, manga, anime, video games, Hollywood. And with each retelling, the samurai became cleaner, stranger, and sometimes more supernatural. The katana became almost magical. The warrior became almost incapable of fear. Bushido became an eternal code. Seppuku became the inevitable response to dishonor. Reality faded behind an extraordinarily powerful image. But the real samurai were more interesting precisely because they were not mythical. They worried about money. They argued about status. They wrote poetry. They practiced religion. They raised children. They betrayed one another. They served governments. They changed professions. They feared death. And sometimes they faced it anyway. Perhaps that is why the mythology survived. Because beneath the armor and ritual was something recognizable: the attempt to impose order on a violent and uncertain world. For nearly 7 centuries, the samurai repeatedly changed what it meant to be a warrior. Mounted archers became feudal retainers. Battlefield soldiers became administrators. Administrators became symbols. And symbols became legends. But there is still one question left. If so much of what we think we know about samurai was shaped after their age had already ended, what exactly was real? That is where this story has to finish. So after 7 centuries of war, ritual, betrayal, philosophy, and reinvention, what was a samurai, really? Not the perfect warrior we inherited from movies. Not a man without fear. Not someone born knowing an eternal code. A samurai was something much more difficult to define. Because the samurai of 1185 was not the samurai of 1600. And the samurai of 1600 was not the samurai of 1850. The earliest were provincial warriors whose power grew as Japan's central government weakened. Many fought primarily on horseback with bows. Later, samurai became retainers inside increasingly sophisticated military governments. During the Sengoku age, they lived in a world where loyalty mattered, but betrayal could decide the fate of the country. Under Tokugawa peace, many became bureaucrats, scholars, and administrators who might never experience a major battle. And finally, their descendants watched a modern Japanese state dismantle the class that had ruled the country for centuries. The samurai survived because they changed, and perhaps that is the first thing the legend hides from us. We remember permanence. Their history was transformation. Even their most famous symbols changed meaning. The sword was real. Its craftsmanship could be extraordinary, but it was never a supernatural weapon. Bushido contained ideas with deep roots in warrior culture, but it was never one identical code followed unchanged by every samurai. Zen influenced parts of warrior culture, but samurai were not mystical monks who discovered some secret method for eliminating fear. And seppuku existed, but behind the ritual were human beings confronting politics, punishment, reputation, family, and death. Strip away the mythology, and you do not make the samurai less extraordinary. You make them more human. Imagine living inside their world. Your family name could determine your future. Your lord's defeat could destroy everything you owned. A decision made hundreds of kilometers away could force you into a war. The man fighting beside you today might serve your enemy tomorrow. Your reputation could survive longer than your body. And death was not an abstract possibility. It was something your culture taught you to think about before it arrived. That may explain the fascination with death poems. Some warriors and other Japanese figures composed jisei, poems associated with their final moments. They were not magical incantations. They were attempts to put language around something language cannot solve. Impermanence, the knowledge that everything ends, a battle, a dynasty, a reputation, a life. And that idea was present long before Hollywood gave the samurai their mythology. The Taira disappeared beneath the water at Da-no-ura. Yoshitsune was destroyed after helping his brother win Japan. Nobunaga was betrayed at the height of his power. Hideyoshi unified the country and still could not make his dynasty secure. Tokugawa Ieyasu built a warrior government whose success eventually created a world where warriors became less necessary. Saigo Takamori fought against a modern state he had helped create. Again and again, the same pattern. Victory contains the beginning of the next problem. Perhaps that is why the samurai still feel different from almost every other warrior class in history. They left behind more than weapons. They left an argument about what a warrior should be. Disciplined but capable of brutality. Loyal but living in a history filled with betrayal. Prepared for death but unmistakably human in the face of it. Cultivated enough to appreciate poetry and violent enough to take an enemy's head. Those contradictions are not flaws in the story. They are the story. The real samurai were never as perfect as the legend. They were more complicated, more adaptable, more political, and in many ways, more fascinating. Because the most remarkable thing about them was never that they lived without fear. It was that generations of warriors built an identity around the question of what to do when fear, duty, and death arrive at the same time. The samurai disappeared. The question did not. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We put out something like this every single day. The version of the story that survives contact with the actual evidence. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment, a real one. Tell me what part of this actually surprised you. And tell me what civilization, what forgotten site, what quiet piece of hidden history you want us to look at next. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging.